Hello everyone, welcome to Within the Frame. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. Who's heard of Korea discount? This decades-long phenomenon has hunted the local capital market for a long time. It refers to the tendency of South Korean listed companies to be undervalued compared to others in the global market. The main reasons behind this are known to be weak corporate governance and insufficient shareholder returns. The government is showing a strong willingness to elevate the Korean stock market's price-to-book value ratio, coming up with a program called the Corporate Value Up. Known to have benchmarked Japan, some expect such initiatives to effectively boost the company's value, while others say they are rather disappointing. What exactly is this Korea discount, and how did experts see the government's guidelines? For this, we invited Professor Yang Jun-seok from the Catholic University of Korea. Professor Yang, welcome.
Be happy to be here.
And we also have Professor Hwagyun Kim from Mays Business School of Texas A&M University. Good to have you with us, Professor Kim.
Pleasure to be here.
All right, Professor Yang, we first need to talk about what the Korea discount is and if it really has been haunting the local capital market for decades. Now, what is it, and have firms on the Korean stock market really been undervalued compared to other countries?
Okay, well, we have been, as you said, discussing this for decades, and the way that you usually calculate it is try to measure how the average stock prices for Korean market differ from other countries. And one study by a national research institute looking at data between 2012 and 2021 calculated that Korea's stock prices on the average are about 52% below where it should be compared to advanced country markets, taking into account what the basic management variables like growth and capital ratios were, and it was about 58% behind emerging market stock prices. Other studies looking at comparing Morgan Stanley's Capital International indices calculate that Korean stocks are about 36% lower than advanced country stock markets and about 16% below emerging market stock prices. Now, which companies are most affected? Well, that's not very clear because a lot of this is sort of a statistical guesswork, but most studies do seem to indicate that major Korean companies, almost all major Korean companies like Samsung companies, LG companies, Hyundai Motors, they all seem to be affected, some to a greater extent, some to a lesser extent, but all seem to be affected by this lower valuation of the stock compared to their book value or their profitability.
Right, so it seems Korea discount does really exist, and I guess it is in line with how Korea's stock market price to book value ratio stayed at 1.05 last year. Now, Professor Kim, experts say there are mainly two reasons behind such undervaluation. First is weak corporate governance. Could you tell us more about this?
Sure. First of all, according to many studies, mostly studying the U.S. market, the corporate governance may affect or indeed affects the future stock returns, but then there are also a lot of studies showing that it's not. So I think, the results itself is a bit controversial. So having said that, what's the possible, the theories or the mechanism of the weak corporate governance affecting the stock market in case of South Korea? So one is definitely the shareholder activism is not enough in that, relatively, the limited shareholder activism exists in South Korea. So minority shareholders, or both the domestic and foreigners, they don't actually have enough rights to influence the corporate decisions. And therefore, the management held accountable is something difficult. And also the board composition may be somewhat different from the other countries more advanced, the stock markets. So maybe it is true that there must be some compromise of this board ability to affect the effective oversight of the management, and also the regulation wise it may be somewhat too strict, so that the governance actually is going to be somewhat swayed by the government policies as well as the larger stakeholders such as the owners of the conglomerates. And lastly, I think, somewhat related to the transparency of like this disclosure. And I think, many of the Korean firms tend to hide some of the information until it is really just imminent or bad. So that may be something related to it. But again, I think we don't know exactly if this is affecting the Korea discount.
All right, I see. Well, we are going to talk about excessive regulation, but I hear another reason is actually insufficient levels of shareholder return. Now, Professor Yang, is this in any way closely related to what our Professor Kim already told us?
Somewhat. I think Korea does not really care too much about stockholders because, well, the Korean tradition. I hesitate to call it culture, but Korean corporate culture seems to be that, well, legally, stockholders are the owners of the company, and that's how the law understands it. But in reality and effectively, the founders and their families seems to be the owner of the company. That's reflected in Korea's fair trade laws, where they ask a founding family member to stand for the owner of the company so that they can be responsible for any problems that come up. So we have this very strange dual structure of ownership for companies, and because the Korean Korean management prefers having a family member as the effective leader of the company, I think they tend to ignore what's happening with the stockholders. I remember about 2007 or 2008, I was talking with an investor who said that he will never invest in Korea again. And apparently what happened was he invested in a small, medium-sized company in Korea. And when he got concerned about some of the management practices and pointed those out and tried to give some advice on how to run the company, well, the owner just apparently just said, just give me money and keep your mouth shut. And I think that maybe not as bluntly, but I think that may be how a lot of companies look at stockholders. Now, as far as dividends dividends are concerned, well, technically, you can have low dividends and still have a very high stock prices if your company is growing considerably. But right now, most Korean companies are not growing that quickly. And then you can have a lot of cash in the company, but there has to be some reassurance that this cash is going to be used well, prepare for volatility in the future, or reserve cash for investment in the future. But Korea already has a very high level of per capita capital per worker, so there might not be any good cash reasons to use cash. So there might be a lot of practices that goes on in Korea, which is not perhaps understandable or acceptable to foreign investors or long-term value investors, whether they be Korean or foreign.
All right, I see. It's quite interesting to hear that Korea has unique corporate, culture of having dual structure of ownership, like our Professor Yang just told us. Now, Professor Kim, some cite geopolitical risks related to North Korea and excessive regulations in the country as other reasons behind this decades-old phenomenon as well. What is your view on this?
Yeah, in addition to what just Professor Yang told, which I think is important, clearly the political risk, the geopolitical risk is probably the most important source of the Korea discount, I believe. Actually, if you look at the Korean market, whenever the North Korean the missile strikes or some of these kind of things are news actually just revealed, then you can kind of see the stock market and also the futures just dropping very rapidly. And I think this is a perennial problem. And also the investors, especially the foreign investors, relatively are limited in terms of information. So unlike the Korean people living in Korea, it's not going to be as the simple as it sounds. And because even with like 5% chance that they may not be able to get their money back if like some war or like war-like situations happen. What should you do, right? That's something that bother, the potential investors and as well as the existing investors. So I think clearly it is one of the big reasons. And then it is above and beyond the default risk because Korea's default risk is pretty low. So I think that's probably one of the main reasons.
All right. Well, I totally understand their concerns, and I can definitely see this as a chronic issue. Now that we know what the problem is, we need to talk about solutions. And for this, Professor Kim, to enhance South Korea's corporate value, the Yoon administration came up with the Corporate Value Up program. Before we get into the details, could there be any specific reason why the government is trying hard to boost the valuation of stocks at this moment?
So I think, it is understandable because government has to do something. So clearly, if you just remember, the price to book ratio or the market to book ratio, as we just call, is pretty low. So the Japan and some other countries also have tried and just trying, like what would be a good way to boost, the stock price. And clearly, one of the reasons is probably just to increase the growth of firms so that the overall economic growth actually is going to be spurred. And also, I think, the investment should be attracted so that stock market is going to be booming, and that's probably their wish. And also, I think one of the key things is they will just keep looking at the market to book or the return on equity or the ROE ratios to see that if there are certain companies seem to be abnormally lower or they just do not reveal or disclose information properly, and then I think they'll try to nudge the firms so that I think they'll try to just to be a little more transparent and also just upfront in terms of the increasing these type of values. Issue is, of course, these are just recommendations, which is, of course, enough. But how effective is it? Is that going to be an issue? But that's basically the idea.
Right, I see. Well, our Professor Kim already told us that it's just a bunch of recommendations, but I'd like to delve a little bit deeper into it. And for this, Professor Yang, I heard the Corporate Value Up program is a guideline to encourage companies to elevate their value, and the government would offer tax incentives for those companies to come up with measures according to their own plans. Could you tell us more about the program itself?
Yeah, it really doesn't include a lot of concrete measures. The companies are supposed to examine annually their return to equity and other relevant ratios, profitability indicators, corporate governance indicators, and figure out their supposed current status and current value. And then the companies will establish long-term, that is 3 years or more, plans with concrete objectives and timeframes to try to fix some of these problems and raise these performance indicators. And it should include discussions with stockholders, stakeholders, and outside investors. And then they're supposed to publicize the results of these discussions and publicize what their objectives are and how they are doing meeting these objectives at least once every year. And the companies which carry out these type of plans, which is mostly just self-evaluation and then publicizing those results and discussions with the stakeholders. If you carry out those type of discussions, if you publicize them, then you will get tax incentives, though I am not quite sure what those tax incentives are going to be, at least so far. And at least according to the some of the more newspaper articles that are coming today, it's not clear how many large companies are really interested because perhaps if they really want to raise the value of their stocks, reduce the Korean discount, they may have to make some changes, especially in corporate governance, that they may not want to make.
All right, so there aren't many concrete measures that are forcing the companies to actually do the job. Now, Professor Kim, we need to take a look at where this originated from. This program reportedly is similar to a Japanese directive that has been encouraging undervalued companies to come up with reform plans. But what made Japan do that in the first place, and did this measure work?
So the answer is kind of yes and no. So as we know, the Japan has been struggling with deflation for like 3 decades or 4, depending on how you measure. So they really were desperate to finish this, and they even started purchasing stocks for this by the Bank of Japan. So it's like open market purchase for stocks, which is extreme. So even with that, I think it was not as effective as it was as just they wanted until very recently. And until very recently, they did the same thing, and it was not working well. But then I think as inflation increases, and also finally they were somewhat able to escape from the deflation, I think this policy started working. So it's a bit different, I would say, compared to the South Korean market, because in case of South Korea, we didn't have like the deflation, for instance. And also, I don't think the Bank of Korea was going to or is going to just purchase the stocks with their the printed money. So I think it's a bit different.
Right, I see. Well, it is definitely, nice to hear that the government is trying to do something in order to elevate the valuation of Korean companies. But Professor Yang, as you have already mentioned, there aren't many clear and concrete measures. And other market observers as well, they express doubts about the effectiveness of the system as it heavily relies on companies voluntarily taking action. What is your opinion on this?
Okay, well, as I said, companies may not want to make the corporate governance decisions that the investors want to eliminate the Korean discount. If the problem may be corporate governance problem has to be dealt with, the rights of the owning families have to be curtailed drastically, and then the high corporate debt status of current Korean firms should also be dealt with, but I think one area that we are ignoring is how government policies or government pressure affects the Korea discount. Taking 2 cases, for example, recently with the Korea Electric Power Company, Korean utility officials refused to raise the electricity prices when the cost of producing electricity went up. So KEPCO had large losses, and KEPCO has a publicly traded stock. So government control over prices, whether it be formal like KEPCO or informal like, say, ramen, may have a lot to do with companies' profitability and, in turn, the Korean discount. And then this is, I think, a problem with the Korean corporate governance structure as well as government policies. But we tend to look at not a single company, but a group of companies that the owning family owns. So if one company gets into a problem, then another company that is owned by the same owner is expected to help the company out. But if you try that in, say, the United States or Europe, you're going to have a hard time, or maybe even it'll be legally impossible for something like that to happen, because these are legally 2 different companies, and the owner's company is using money from one company to help what's legally a independent, separate company. So government control over prices, over how management works, it'll have to be, I think, curtailed substantially as well. And again, I'm not sure if that's going to happen.
All right, I see. Well, based on what our Professor Yang told us, Professor Kim, what more should be done for South Korean companies to boost their corporate value?
I think they have to increase the more like the kind of the engine of growth for each company to increase the profitability, and also try to do the risk management. So if you look at like Korean market from like 1996, for instance, I think it's a long period, but therefore I think you can see the whole picture. From the 1996 to 2024, for instance, I think the Korean stock market has been earning about 8.4% every year. U.S. market has been earning the same period about like the 9%, so slightly lower, but it's not like major big difference. But if you actually look at from like 2015 or 16, then the Korean market has been earning about like 5% or 5.3%, while the US has been earning like 16.8, 17%. So I think that's kind of where start actually quite different. So like around like 2016 or 17, something has changed. I think it could be government policy, it could be regime, it could be tax, or it could be engine of growth. I think we have to start just looking at like, the reasons what actually were quite different between the 2 or 3 countries, why, and, this big developing, the engine has been cooled down. I think that's something that we need to find to boost up the corporate value of Korea.
All right, I see. Well, Professor Kim, thank you for your advice. Now, I'd like to ask many more questions to our experts, but unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition. Thank you, Professor Yang and Professor Kim, for your time and insights today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
All right, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. Unfortunately, today is my last Within the Frame. It has been a great privilege to present this in-depth analysis program, to learn and to meet a wide array of experts. From next week, our very own Han Daeun will be in charge. Thank you and have a lovely weekend. Goodbye.